Hello once again. As we turn our attention to the Psalms, I am happy to have an opportunity to study God's Word with you. This is the fourth of a series of lessons on Psalms 9 and 10. In our first lesson, we summarized Psalm 9. In our second, we summarized Psalm 10. And in our last lesson, we looked at four major themes that both Psalms share. Now, to reiterate what we have said now in three previous lessons, we're studying these two Psalms together because they are very likely in the original a single psalm. If they are not one psalm, they were very likely written so as to be studied together as a single unit. And thus they do share a very similar set of themes. And it's very likely that at some point somebody, because of the difference in tone between the first half and the second half, split it into two separate psalms. But the evidence that they are one psalm, as we have been saying, is that they form an acrostic, with the first psalm, Psalm 9, having the first half of the Hebrew alphabet, and Psalm 10 having the second half of the Hebrew alphabet. And again, they also thematically tie in together. But Psalm 9 presents to us a psalm of victory over the enemies of God. That is, God has given the writer a great victory and has judged the nations. Psalm 10 presents kind of that doubt which preceded the victory. That is, there was consternation and uncertainty as to whether God would act. And indeed, the wicked in Psalm 10 felt confident that God would never act. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to do is examine how these two psalms tie in together and present to us a complete picture of a victory and what came before the victory and the faith that was called for in that moment of uncertainty. And there are some other psalms that do the same, but we're going to just focus on this psalm in this lesson. The Psalm 9, however, as I said, it presents victory, and it presents confidence following a victory. I'll give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, writes David. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. Here we have David seeing God fighting on his behalf. This is a psalm of confidence in the judgment of God. Verse 7, the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. The psalmist sees the victory God has given him, and he wants God to be with him. And there's a prayer in verses 13 and 14 of Psalms 9. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gates of death. As God, keep being with me, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughters of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. So here we have the confidence that God has acted and God has saved. Psalm 10, as I said, though, presents to us the doubt that came before the victory. And in particular, the certainty of the unbeliever that God would not act. And so we have this victory, but we must recognize before the victory came, there were some that were uncertain. And the wicked felt confident that they were going to overcome. Psalm 10 and verse 2, in arrogance the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes they have devised. For the wicked boast of the desire of his soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. In the pride of his face the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are there is no God. And because there is no God in his mind, he feels confident he can get away with whatever he wants. Now, we must understand, and we made this point previously, that is the doubt of the unbeliever. David, as the psalmist, always knew that God was there. The Lord is king forever and ever, and the nations perish from his land. Psalm 10 and verse 16. Now, let's put the psalm in an immediate historical context and make some points about how this could play out. We don't know the exact date or conditions under which Psalm 9 and 10 were written. Many have traditionally ascribed it to David's conquest of Goliath and the subsequent defeat of the Philistines because of David's facing against Goliath. We don't know that that is the case. There's no heading that suggests such, but this is what men have often interpreted being. Let's run with that for just a moment, though, and see how that ties these two psalms together. Now, we know the story that David faced off against Goliath armed with his sling and his staff, and in his sling he placed a stone, and he threw the stone from the sling, struck Goliath in the head. Goliath fell to the ground. David rushed forward, grabbed Goliath's great sword, and cut off Goliath's head. And thus David defeated Goliath. David gained a victory, and the Philistines as a nation were routed from the lands of the Israelites on that day. And we can see when David talks about the nations being driven from God's land, we can see how that could tie in. We also see, though, before David won that fight, there was uncertainty as to whether or not the Israelites would win. There was uncertainty and fear on the part of many in Israel, so that only David had faith to face off against Goliath. Many wondered, though, is God really here? Why is God standing far off, far away, as in Psalm 10 and verse 1? Why was God hiding himself in these times of trouble? Now, of course, God was not hiding himself. He was just waiting for a man of faith to step forward and claim the victory. But the Israelites were cowering in fear. For their part, the Philistines, bolstered by Goliath, were taunting the Israelites. They were saying, "Where is the God of Israel?" And they were assuming they could do whatever they want in opposition to God's people. They could steal and plunder and take the land that God had given to the Israelites. And so they felt emboldened against Israel because they didn't fear God. And so we can see the doubt of Psalm 10 in that circumstance. And then David steps forward and he claims the victory, and afterwards he says that God has given the victory, and God has judged the nations. God has defended the helpless and the poor. That is, he was on the side of the Israelites. And so we can see that playing out. And the psalm being written from after the fact is showing the conditions before the fact, but reminding us that in that moment of doubt and fear, the Israelites needed to trust God. The fear was conquered by faith, and the faith led to rejoicing. I want us to make, though, take this psalm, and we know it was written by David, and I want us to fast forward from David's time to the time of Christ. Because very often when we read the Psalms, and in particular the Psalms of David, we should look for the messianic elements in the Psalms, and we can see that here. Now, in hindsight, as we look back to Jesus being beset by the nations, and notice here Psalm 2 talks about the nations conspiring and plotting a vain thing against the Lord and against his anointed. The cross was very much a conspiracy of the nations against God. And Jesus was the Lamb of God, and he was the one who was poor, and his followers were poor, and they were afflicted. And as Jesus went to the cross, there was that moment of doubt and uncertainty on the part of Jesus' followers, and there was a confidence on the part of the enemy. Now we can look back, just as we can look back with David and see David conquered Goliath, so we can look back to Jesus at the cross and know that Jesus conquered at the cross. God gave Jesus a great victory at the cross, and God judged the nations, and he judged in favor of his Son. And so Jesus died, was buried, but he rose again, and those that sought to destroy Jesus were themselves destroyed upon the rock. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, but also, as the scriptures say, a stone of stumbling, so that men who fall against it dash themselves to pieces. We have a lot of scriptures here with a very similar theme teaching the same thing. But let's again go back to the psalm and go back to the cross. Notice the confidence of the enemy at the cross. He trusted in God, they said. Let God save him. They thought that they would not be moved as they stood against Jesus. They thought God was hiding his face from what they did to Jesus. And though they knew Jesus to be a righteous man, such was their lack of faith in God that even the spiritual leaders of Israel, who should have had more faith in the righteous judgment of God, even they felt confident in putting a righteous man to death. And the disciples of Jesus had that moment of uncertainty where they were wondering, why is God far away? Why is God not here protecting his Son, protecting his Messiah? They had confidence that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. Why was God then not acting? And yet Jesus, like his predecessor David, many, many years before, Jesus had confidence in God. He knew that God was a righteous judge who would do that which was right. He knew that if he prayed to God to see his affliction, that he, as a son, would be heard. And the scriptures tell us that he was heard. But notice Psalm 9, verse 13, and think about this verse in the context of Jesus on the cross. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. That's very much a messianic verse. It speaks to us of the cry of Jesus to God upon the cross, of the hope of Jesus upon the cross. And as we look back at that event, we recognize the one who trusted in God was the truly wise one. Jesus triumphed and he overcame the nations. He received a rod of iron with which he could dash the nations to pieces. Again, a reference to Psalm 2. God gave him the victory, and Jesus was right to trust in God. So what's the lesson to us then, who are the followers of Christ, who are walking in the footsteps of men of faith such as David? Well, the lesson is very similar to us. We are going to reach those moments, those turning points, where we do not yet see the judgment of God. And here we come into Psalm 10. Where is God? Why is he standing far away, we may sometimes ask. The wicked man, perceiving this situation, as in Psalm 10, is going to say to himself, there is no God, there is no judgment, I can do that which I want. And in that confidence, he will act selfishly and wickedly. He will have confidence with which to oppress the poor and seek to have things his way. But just as David won against Goliath, just as Jesus overcame the cross, so too today the man of faith who has the confidence of faith to trust in God will realize at the end that trusting in God was the right answer. God will always judge righteously. We can have confidence that just as God has acted in the past, so too will he continue to act in the future. And by having confidence in God, by knowing that God will indeed judge righteously, we can avoid the pitfall of doubt which might cause us to desire to join the ways of the wicked, to exercise might and worldly influence in order to gain our own way. And instead we'll trust in the righteousness of God, in the shelter that God provides. We will pray with the psalmist, Psalm 9 and verse 19, "Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail, let the nations be judged before you," and we will have confidence that God will indeed judge. As we go back to Psalm 10, to the conclusion of these two psalms, verses 16 through 18, "The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations perish from his land. O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that the man who is of the earth may strike terror no more." God is king. He will continue to be king. And even though the nations themselves might seem very powerful, even though men as a whole set themselves against God and against his anointed, even though they oppress the poor and think to themselves that might makes right, the man of faith knows that God is still listening, God will still act, and that God will still save. And we will make our decisions accordingly. Again, I advise you to go back, reread these Psalms. Reread Psalm 9 and 10 and think about the story of David and Goliath and how these two Psalms might tie into that. But then go back and read them a second time, and this time picture the Psalm with Jesus on the cross in mind. And I think you'll see that these Psalms help paint that picture of his triumph and of the scene of the men below the cross casting aspersions against Christ. But then think about ourselves and our own situations and your situation, and how when you reach that moment of possible doubt, wondering, is there a God? Is he really going to judge? You can look back at how he has judged and acted in the past and have confidence he will continue to do so in the future. I hope that this study of the two Psalms together has been of some benefit to you, has helped you, and I hope that you will continue to study and meditate upon these Psalms and until our next time together. God bless you, and you have a great day.